There is a story that football history books almost never tell in full. A story involving revolvers hidden inside players' socks, a football that nearly tore a nation apart, and a crowd so furious it hurled rocks at a ship. This is not fiction. It actually happened. And today you are going to discover that the first World Cup was not merely a sporting tournament. It was a war dressed up as football. July 1930. The world is on the verge of collapse. The Great Depression has already swallowed the United States and is sweeping across the whole of Europe. Unemployment, hunger, revolutions looming. And in the middle of all that, FIFA decides to hold the first World Cup in history. Not in Paris, not in London, not in Berlin. In Montevideo, Uruguay. A tiny country with fewer than 2 million inhabitants, crossing the Atlantic Ocean to prove to the world that football belonged to South America. But before we talk about the final, you need to understand what was truly at stake. This was not merely about a trophy. It was about continental pride. About a century-old rivalry. About the entire Rio de la Plata basin exploding on a Sunday afternoon. Uruguay had won the Olympics in 1924 and 1928. They were the reigning Olympic champions of the world. The Europeans called them the princes of football. But the Argentines acknowledged none of that. To them, the football of the Rio de la Plata had one owner, and that owner lived in Buenos Aires. And when the two sides met in the final of the first World Cup, on the 30th of July, 1930, what unfolded inside and outside the Estadio Centenario escalated from a match to a diplomatic incident in less than 90 minutes. Think about it. Two neighboring countries, separated only by the widest river in the world, gathered in a newly built stadium, with the newest trophy in football gleaming on the president of FIFA's table. And both teams believing, with absolute conviction, that that trophy belonged to them. The Argentine delegation arrived in Montevideo aboard a ship called the Conti Verde. 150 people. Players, officials, fervent supporters. And from the moment they docked, the tension was palpable. The Uruguayans received them with a calculated coldness. No little flags. No flowers. Just stares. Suspicion. The heavy silence of people who know that this opponent has not come to celebrate, it has come to win. And the Argentines had every reason to believe in the title. That squad carried names that today sound like legends. Guillermo Stabil, the tournament's top scorer, who had netted 8 goals in the group stage. Francisco Varallo, a 19-year-old striker, nimble as a shadow and dangerous as a blade. Manuel Ferreira, the captain, elegant, intelligent, with a footballing vision that the Europeans had not yet grasped. It was a squad built to win. And everyone in Buenos Aires knew it. On the other side, Uruguay possessed something different. They had rage. They had a hunger for history. They had José Nasazi, the captain, a man so commanding on the pitch that his own teammates called him El Gran Moriscal, the Great Marshal. They had Hector Scarwan, considered the finest South American player of that era. And they had Pedro Saya, a man who had come to football from the streets, without leather balls, without proper boots, without anything, only an extraordinary talent that no European scout of the time could ever have measured. But here begins the first great scandal in the history of World Cups. And you need to hear this. The day before the final, both delegations clashed over detail that sounds trivial but revealed everything about that rivalry, which ball would be used in the match. Argentina wanted to use the Argentine ball, manufactured in Buenos Aires, with a different leather, slightly firmer, that favored the attacking style of the plate players. Uruguay wanted to use the Uruguayan ball, more pliable, heavier when wet, which suited the physical and collective game of the Chihuahuas. FIFA, in a decision worthy of Solomon, ruled that each team would play with its own ball for one half of the match. 1 ball per half. Yes, you read that correctly. The final of the first World Cup was played with 2 different footballs. And that changed everything. In the first half, with the Argentine ball, Argentina were the better side. Far better. Carlos Pucel opened the scoring with a goal of pure artistry, dribbling past 2 defenders and placing the ball into the corner with surgical composure. Then Guillermo Stabil capitalized on an error by the Uruguayan defense and made it 2-0. Argentina were winning the first World Cup. In Montevideo. Inside the stadium the Uruguayans had built to celebrate their country's independence. The irony was too cruel to be accidental. The terraces fell into a deathly silence. 133,000 people, a figure still debated to this day, though most historical records point to that staggering number, holding their breath. The Argentines in the stadium celebrated quietly, knowing that any more exuberant display could turn to violence in an instant. Because in that stadium, on that day, there were revolvers. Not metaphorically. Literally. Records of the era, compiled decades later by football historians such as Julio Friedenberg and Eduardo Galeano, confirm that supporters on both sides entered the stadium armed. The Uruguayan police had conducted searches, but those searches were selective, politically motivated, and a great deal slipped through. There were reports of players receiving threats in the dressing rooms before the match had even kicked off. There was psychological pressure of an intensity that no European player of the time had ever experienced. And it was in that atmosphere of terror and glory that Uruguay began to turn the game around. In the second half, the ball changed. And with it, the football changed too. Pedro Saya received the ball at the edge of the area, controlled it on his chest, and struck with a restrained, almost furious violence that sent it into the top corner before Argentine goalkeeper Juan Batasso could even react. 2-1. The Estadio Centenario erupted. That sound, 133,000 people screaming simultaneously, is described in the journalistic records of the day as something resembling continuous thunder, an earthquake of voices audible from the far bank of the Rio de la Plata. Then came Santos a riot. A goal that seemed improbable, emerging from a disorganized, almost chaotic move, yet arriving with a precision that appeared rehearsed. 2-2. Level. The match was alive again. And then, just as the Argentines were still trying to absorb the shock, Hector Castro, a man who had lost his right hand in a childhood accident, who played with his arm amputated below the elbow, and who was affectionately known as El Manco, the one-armed, Hector Castro scored the fourth goal. 3-2. Uruguay in front. Uruguay, world champions. Referee John Langinas, a Belgian with an immaculate moustache and a tweed coat who had insisted on having a ship reserved for immediate escape after the match, because he himself was uncertain whether he would leave that stadium alive, blew the final whistle. And what happened next is one of the most extraordinary, and simultaneously most unsettling, scenes in the history of sport. The Uruguayan players wept. Not with joy, at first. They wept with relief. Like men who have just survived something that could have gone terribly wrong. Nasazzi was the first to drop to his knees on the pitch. Then he rose, looked to the sky, and raised his arms in a gesture that the cameras captured and that became one of the most iconic images in early football. That photograph, taken by a photographer whose name was unfortunately lost in the deteriorated archives of Montevideo's newspaper El Dia, shows Nasazzi with his face contorted in an expression that mingles victory, exhaustion, and something resembling disbelief. As if even he, the captain, the great marshal, could not quite believe what had just happened. On the other side, Francisco Varallo, who until his final days, passing away in 2010 at the age of 100, was the last surviving player from that final, said in an interview decades later that when the referee blew the whistle, he sat down on the pitch and could not move for several minutes. "I cried," said Varallo. "I cried a great deal. Because we knew we had played well. We knew we could have won. And then you look up at the scoreboard and see that you've lost, and that feeling never leaves you." But the true scandal was only just beginning. And it did not unfold on the pitch. The morning after the final, Buenos Aires woke in mourning. Argentine newspapers, which had printed special editions with triumphant headlines before the match had even finished, such was their confidence in victory, had to be recalled in haste and replaced by emergency editions. The radio broadcast the result on a loop. And the streets of Buenos Aires filled with a rage that had nowhere to go. Groups of supporters, furious and humiliated, marched to the Uruguayan consulate in Buenos Aires and stoned the windows. Not metaphorically. With actual stones. The consulate was left with its windows shattered, its outer wall covered in graffiti, and the Uruguayan consul required a police escort to leave the building safely. Argentina severed diplomatic relations with Uruguay for days. Some historical records speak of weeks. And when the ship carrying the Uruguayan delegation sailed back into Montevideo, crossing the Rio de la Plata laden with champion players and the Golden World Cup trophy, more than 100,000 people were waiting at the port. 100,000 people. In 1930. In a country with fewer than 2 million inhabitants. That reception is considered to this day one of the largest spontaneous gatherings in Uruguayan history. And here is the detail that very few people know. the trophy handed over that day was not exactly the official trophy. The original, created by French sculptor Abel Lafleur, cast in solid gold, featuring the figure of Nike, the Greek goddess of victory, holding an octagon above her head, was still being completed. What the Uruguayans held aloft at that port was a provisional replica. The real trophy arrived weeks later. But no one cared. Because what mattered was not the object. It was what it represented. The impact of that World Cup on the global game was immense and enduring in ways that still shape the present without our even noticing. Europe, humiliated by its absence, only 4 European sides participated in the tournament, all of them second-ranked nations, because the major powers declined the invitation, citing the length and cost of the journey, understood that it had missed something crucial. That while Europeans debated amateurism and professionalism, South Americans were inventing a different kind of football, more fluid, more technical, more collective. A football that Europe would take decades to fully assimilate. The rivalry between Uruguay and Argentina, already old and deep, was forever marked by that afternoon of the 30th of July. To this day, when the two sides meet, there is something in that fixture that goes beyond football. There is the memory of that scoreline. There is the ghost of that Argentine ball that proved insufficient. There is the spirit of Hector Castro, the one-armed man who scored the winning goal in a World Cup final. And there is a question that Francisco Varallo carried for 100 years of life, and that was never fully answered. What if both halves had been played with the same ball? What if there had been no revolvers in the stadium? What if the Belgian referee had not needed an escape ship? Would the result have been different? Would history have been different? Perhaps we shall never know. But what we do know is that on that day, in Montevideo, beneath a sky that the newspapers of the time described as grey and heavy, as though the weather itself knew what was about to happen, world football changed its address. It ceased to be an English sport exported to the world and became something greater, something more complex, something that combined politics, national identity, historical rivalry, and collective passion in a mixture that no other sport has ever managed to replicate. The 1930 World Cup was not merely the beginning of a tournament. It was the beginning of a religion. And if you have stayed until this point, if you felt that chill down your spine that the true history of football produces, then you already know that this channel is not about results. This channel is about the stories beneath the results. The stories buried in archives, in yellowed newspapers, in the memories of players who are no longer with us. Tell us in the comments, what did you make of this story? Did you know the final was played with 2 different balls? Tell us as well which city and which country you are watching from, because this channel has viewers in more than 40 countries, and every message you leave makes an enormous difference. Leave a like if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you want to know more. And if you have not yet subscribed, subscribe now. Turn on the bell. Because the stories on the way are even more intense, even more surprising, even more secret than this one. Oh, and one more thing. While producing this script, researching the archives and revisiting the history of this World Cup, we stumbled upon something very interesting, a product connected to exactly this world of historical football and Rio de la Plata nostalgia, the sort of thing you would not expect to find but that makes complete sense the moment you see it. I am not going to reveal what it is here, because that would spoil the surprise. If you are curious, have a look at the link pinned in the first comment. It is an honest recommendation, without any exaggeration. You will understand when you see it. And finally, what happened at the 1934 World Cup was even darker than this. Mussolini, intimidation of referees, a goal still contested to this day, and a national team that vanished from history as though it had never existed. That story is coming soon. You will not want to miss it.